Mitt Romney wins Iowa's caucus by a whisker as the U.S. presidential race begins. So what does it say about the divided Republican field? You're watching Inside Story U.S. 2012 from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lisa Fletcher. The 2012 U.S. presidential nomination race is up and running, and it's Mitt Romney who is leading the pack for the Republican Party after voters in Iowa had their say on the choice of candidates.
Thank you so much for all your help. On to New Hampshire.
In the end, it came down to just 8 votes. The former Massachusetts governor in a nail-biting finish with Rick Santorum. With his sweater vests and pickup truck, the former Pennsylvania senator had campaigned hard to court the hard-right conservative vote, and he enjoyed a late surge. But it was a disastrous night for Michelle Bachmann, who's now dropped out, and also Rick Perry. Both had at one time led opinion polls. The revolving cast of characters challenging Romney is perhaps a sign that the party is still struggling to find a unified voice. Of course, there is still time for another candidate to break through. Remember, John McCain finished 4th in Iowa in 2008. And what will the U.S. President Barack Obama make of the divided Republican field as he prepares to face the eventual nominee? Al Jazeera's senior Washington correspondent Alan Fisher has this from Des Moines, Iowa.
The very close result here in Iowa is perhaps a reflection of the battle that the Republican Party has been fighting with itself over the past few months. Does it support the socially conservative right-wing candidate who appeals to core party voters, or does it go for the more moderate candidate who's likely to challenge Barack Obama much more keenly in any general election? Mitt Romney may have topped the poll here in Iowa, but Rick Santorum was the big winner. The former Pennsylvania senator, coming from virtually nowhere in the opinion polls months ago, to within a whisker of topping the poll here in Iowa. The campaign moves on to New Hampshire. Mitt Romney is almost certainly going to win there, but Rick Santorum will be looking at South Carolina. There he will try to establish himself as a power in the party, as someone who can really challenge Mitt Romney to become the Republican Party nominee, and as a candidate who can really challenge Barack Obama in the general election in November.
So what can we learn from the Iowa caucus? To discuss Tuesday's vote and look forward to the upcoming Republican primaries, we're joined from Denver, Colorado by journalist and political commentator David Sirota. And here in the studio, we have Republican strategist Ford O'Connell, who was an advisor to the McCain-Palin campaign in 2008. And we have Michelle Diggles, who works for Third Way, a public policy think tank based here in Washington, D.C. She studies the U.S. electorate, paying special attention to independent voters. Thanks to all of you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So I want to start out kind of broadly talking about Iowa, being very clear to our American viewers what's going on, and then setting the stage for our international viewers as well. We had a situation last night where nobody was a dominant winner. We've got 3 candidates who are essentially sharing the same slice of the pie, or equal slices of the pie. And then we've got Newt Gingrich, who really is in no worse of a position than McCain was coming out of Iowa in 2008.
No, absolutely. I mean, Newt Gingrich has a chance to have second life if Rick Santorum, fails as the anti-Romney candidate. But what we did see coming out of Iowa is that Mitt Romney met expectations, and he is still the Republican presidential frontrunner. The question is will the anti-Romney voting bloc, which is comprised primarily of Tea Partiers and social conservatives, will they consolidate behind one candidate? And if they do that, then Mitt Romney could be in real trouble. But right now, he is still the prohibitive favorite.
David Sirota, is that your view as well?
I think so. I think that's absolutely right. I think, though, that Rick Santorum's got a real shot, in the sense that, the easiest way to analyze the race is to say, well, in Iowa what happened was you had the 3 branches of the Republican Party basically win or come very close to winning. You had Mitt Romney representing kind of Main Street business conservatives. You had Rick Santorum representing evangelical conservatives, the religious right. And you had Ron Paul representing a kind of libertarian base of the Republican Party. The one thing that analysis misses is that Rick Santorum is somebody whose congressional record is not just demarcated on social conservatism. I mean, this is a guy who has very, very close ties, at least in terms of a congressional voting record and in terms of running campaigns with corporate America. So I think what you're going to see is Rick Santorum reach out to Mitt Romney's supporters and say, hey, listen, I'm the guy who is also not just a social conservative, but I'm also an economic conservative. And I think that's where this is going to play out
David,
in terms of friction in New Hampshire.
You're absolutely right. The question is he's going to get 1 week straight of airtime because Rick Santorum's the big story coming out of Iowa. Can he get the campaign finances and the assets in place to make a credible run in South Carolina and Florida? Obviously, he's unlikely to win New Hampshire. The question is will Ron Paul and John Huntsman help him enough by eating into what would be Mitt Romney's supporters so that he has a better than expected showing? If he can do that and make a credible case in South Carolina, I may well agree with you.
Michelle Diggles, what do we know? What did we learn last night in the caucus that's going to help us move forward? What do we learn about the contenders that maybe we didn't know before?
The big lesson from Iowa is that the Republicans have an enthusiasm problem. Everyone was talking about how the Iowa caucuses would break the records of 2008 for GOP attendance, and indeed they did. There were 122,000 GOP caucusers last night in Iowa, compared to about 119,000 that was in 2008. But here's what no one's really talking about. There are actually fewer Republicans participating in the caucuses last night and more independents than there were in 2008. So there's actually 11,000 fewer Republicans in 2012's Iowa caucuses than in 2008. Which means Republicans aren't fired up. Independents were fired up for Ron Paul. And really, how does Mitt Romney do with independents? About the same as he did in 2008. He maxes out in Iowa at 18 or 19%. So the GOP has an independence problem.
Well, and David, you touched on this a moment ago. You talked about the three branches of the Republican Party. At what point does the GOP have to unify and have a single message to appeal to these independent voters so they don't feel like they may be looking at a party without focus and without stability? Do they have much time to come together?
I think that there's plenty of time, actually, and I think that the White House right now probably believes that the longer this drags on, the bigger the fight is, the worse it is for the Republican Party. I don't take that view. I mean, I don't want to see the Republican Party win the election, but I don't take that view, and I don't take that view because of what we learned from Barack Obama. I mean, the Democratic primary back in 2008 was one of the most contentious primaries, longest primaries in that party's history, and it served, I think, to benefit Barack Obama because it familiarized the country with who he was and what he stood for. Now, you can make the argument, well, if that happens and one of the Republican candidates gets known to be an extremist, somebody who's out of step with the country, that could hurt them. But I don't necessarily think it's automatically true that the longer this drags on, the worse it is for the Republican Party.
That seems to hold true if Rick Santorum is the guy, but everybody knows Newt Gingrich, they know Ron Paul, they know Mitt Romney.
Well, they do know a lot of these folks, but I do think that 2012 is very different than 2008 because in that situation you had an open race, and once the economy sort of hit the toilet, it almost didn't matter who the Democratic nominee was. They were going to win the White House. In fact, the Republicans could have had a combined ticket of Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, and they still were going to lose. That's how bad the situation got in 2008. But in 2012, I do think what is important is I understand it can go a long way, but it can't go too long because eventually Republicans do have to get behind one candidate, and that candidate is going to have to unify their message because the one thing I can say about President Obama, he may not be a very good president, but he is one of the best campaigners I've ever seen. And the opposition research and the attacks he's going to use to come after the Republican candidate will be almost ungodly.
Al Jazeera went out and asked people here in D.C. what they thought about the Republican Party. Here's what they said.
We're trying to get people to say what they think the Republican Party now stands for. Have you
Nothing.
looked at that?
Nothing. They stand for nothing.
More dysfunctional now than any time that I've seen it.
It doesn't seem like there's a coherent message. There's just a lot of sound and fury right now.
The Republican Party has been taken over by the faction is the Tea Party. They're exerting far more influence than their numbers. And it is really, they need to have a showdown.
And along the same lines, here is something that Newt Gingrich had to say. Let's be clear, one of the things which became obvious in the last few weeks in Iowa is that there will be a great debate in the Republican Party. And before we're prepared to have a great debate with Barack Obama. True?
It is very true. Right now, the Republican Party has an internal fight that I think a lot of non-Republicans are reading too much into. We're having a fight between what we see as establishment Republicans and conservatives. And the question is which group will win out in that fight. But I do think that both sides do not like President Obama at all. As such, they will eventually unify behind whoever the nominee is, but they all want to feel that they got their voice out there, they got a fair shake, and they had enough candidates in the field who represent their specific views.
Michelle Diggles,
but I would take a different view on that. I mean, I think the issue is that, setting aside Ron Paul for a second here, I think why the Republican Party right now seems so incoherent is because President Obama has mimicked the Republican Party in so many ways. President Obama's health care bill is almost the exact same thing as Mitt Romney's health care bill. President Obama has extended, if not exacerbated, some of the wars, some of the foreign policies, some of the civil liberties policies that President Bush and the Republican Party have liked to saber rattle over for so many years. So what ends up happening is that the Republicans either have one of two choices. They've either been forced to go even farther to the right, out of step with the American population, or they've just seemed like they're just against Barack Obama no matter what he does, no matter how many positions of theirs he co-opts.
Michelle.
I think let me just say, the real problem for the Republicans and for Mitt Romney is this. The longer this battle drags on and the more influential the Tea Party is in the primary process, the more Mitt Romney and other candidates are twisting themselves, and particularly Mitt Romney, he's twisting himself into a pretzel, absolutely trying to appease the Tea Party. I mean, he's disavowing previous beliefs. He's incoherent on foreign policy. I mean, there are a lot of problems in the Republican Party right now. And so I think, you know, they're losing independents. They're losing the center of the electorate. They're not just going to magically get them back overnight. You're right. President Obama and the Democrats are going to run a really aggressive re-election campaign. And if I'm them, I'm going to run clip after clip after clip of Mitt Romney saying, I am the Tea Party and the Tea Party is me.
Michelle, I hear what you're saying, but regardless of who the Republican nominee is, say Ron Paul, who's not going to win the Republican nomination, this entire election is so tight it's going to come down to 8 states. And the question is, can the Republican nominee win independents, Hispanics, and seniors in those 8 battleground states? And the 2 most important states within the 8 are Florida and Ohio. And if the Republican nominee can win Florida and Ohio, we're going to have a new president come next November.
Well, in Florida, the trend has been for more independents, not more registration of Democrats or Republicans. So you have disaffected voters in Florida.
This is true, but as we both know, there are 2 types of independents. There's your run-of-the-mill independent, and then there's your independent who leans one way or the other, and the question is, can you just make the sell to them?
Yeah, this is the myth of Washington, D.C., though, that independent voters lean one way and tend to vote for one party. Let's look at the data, right? I'm a data person. I deal with data. Between the 2008 and the 2010 elections, there was a 27-point shift in independent voters. Democrats went from an 8-point victory in 2008 to a 17-point loss in 2010. 27-point shift. Independent voters are not consistently voting for Democrats or Republicans, even if they claim to lean one way or the other. They swing quite wildly. Independents, in fact, are rented. They're not owned.
No, absolutely.
Which of course gets to the point of I think, really what the determining factor is going to be, frankly, where is the economy? And I know that's kind of oversimplifies things, and it's not all that satisfactory. But I think if the nominee is Mitt Romney, somebody who has won and has a history, at least in Massachusetts, of winning at times some independent voters, if the economy is down and the nominee is Mitt Romney, it is going to be a very, very difficult battle for President Obama. I think it's just that simple, because I think that's where the independent voters are going to go. They tend to go with the economy.
Michelle, based strictly on the independent vote, if you had to match up one of the GOP contenders with Obama right now, who would you pick?
I would say Obama does best with independent voters against Gingrich. In Gingrich is where we see Obama really wins. With Mitt Romney, and there seems to be about a 10-point margin with independent voters. I think I saw some USA Gallup polling of the battleground states, and with all voters, it was a virtual statistical tie in those states between Obama and Romney, but just independents, it was about 10 or 12 points. I think that Romney was beating Obama.
So surprising to many people, perhaps, because we keep hearing this drumbeat that Ron Paul is the one who really holds the independent vote. Is that not the case?
No, I think Ron Paul does hold the independent vote, but I think when independents are forced to choose right now, they tend to be breaking towards Romney, but there's still a lot of undecided independents.
And I think that goes to David's point. It goes to the fact that the U.S. economy is so far down in the doldrums that whichever candidate can best make the case that they're best suited for the economy moving forward and for the long term is the one that's going to win it. And back to your independent point, it's the independents, and to David's point, it's the independents in Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania that we know are most concerned about the economy right now, at least among the states that matter.
Right, but keep in
mind.
Yeah,
and I think the tactic from the White House will be to try to essentially say that this election is not a referendum on the president, not a referendum on the economy. It's a referendum on the unpalatability of the Republican nominee. Now, this is it's the only gamble, frankly, the White House can make. But I think it's a decent gamble if the nominee is somebody who is genuinely unpalatable. I think it's difficult to make Mitt Romney as unpalatable, let's say, as Newt Gingrich or as, frankly, Rick Santorum, because I think Mitt Romney has shown himself to be a fairly effective chameleon. And I don't mean that to be a compliment to Mitt Romney, but I think that the Republicans are going to basically, and I think that this is why it's going to be such a close race, they're going to do what every presidential candidate does, is try to make this a referendum on the president and on the economy. And that has been a winning strategy in the past.
Well, it has been a winning strategy, and what the president is trying to do in reverse is he's trying to blame the do-nothing Republican House. He's also trying to dabble in a little bit of class warfare, if you will, across the country. And, you know, it may or may not work, but if you continue to push long enough on class warfare and the Republicans figure out how to message the fact that entitlement reform, tax reform, and regulatory reform will promote a strong economy and job growth, then you're absolutely right. Then the Republicans are going to wind up winning the White House, and it really comes down to the economy and who the battleground states, independents among others, feel is best served to move that forward.
Yeah, but both Democrats and Republicans have to be cautious when talking about the economy, because independents, they believe they're the haves, not the have-nots. Over 55% of independents claim to be in the haves category. They don't see themselves as victims. They're not the long-suffering poor, and you can't appeal to them with an overly pessimistic message.
What appeals to them?
A more optimistic message.
And who's got that message?
Right now, I don't think anybody's got that message.
Does Barack Obama have that message?
David?
Yes and no. I mean, I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but I think that when the problem for Obama is not that he's gone class warrior. The problem for Obama is that his rhetoric of populism, his belated rhetoric of populism, going up against Wall Street, is belied by a record of somebody who has supported bailouts, who has fundraised the most, raised the most money from Wall Street. His rhetoric looks, frankly, in many cases, ridiculous. And so I think he has kind of a credibility gap problem. And that's why one thing we're not talking about here, which I lament, is the fact that we're not talking about the enthusiasm for President Obama. We're not talking about the 2008 candidacy of Barack Obama, which was much more of a base Democratic strategy to get out the vote.
Well,
what we're now talking about is we're back to the
1996
election, where Bill Clinton was sort of forced to try to, put together a very feeble coalition and barely won. I mean, he won because there were 3 candidates, but he didn't get over 50%.
So speaking of the Get Out the Vote campaign and the young voters that Barack Obama had in 2008, does he get those back? Where are they going?
They could very well sit out, or they could decide, hey, I've got too many bills to pay. This may not continue.
Could they go to Ron Paul?
The question is, Ron Paul's not going to win the GOP nomination. It's that simple. The question is, does he run as a third-party candidate? And if he runs as a third-party candidate, the Republican nominee is going to lose. It's that simple.
Michelle, do you agree with that?
I do. I think that if Ron Paul has an aggressive third-party campaign, not just a fringe campaign, not a Nader-like campaign, but a real serious campaign, he could draw votes from the GOP. We also have to watch what's going on with Americans Elect. They've really been putting up, getting on the ballot in a number of states. They could pose a threat depending on who gets nominated there. If it's a libertarian candidate, that again could draw from the GOP and could pull some independents. But if it's a more moderate candidate, it could pull votes away from Barack Obama. And the truth is that the base of the Democratic Party is not actually ideological liberals, but moderates. So President Obama has to appeal to moderates, and he also has to win independents in the swing states in order to get to 270. And I think that's really what he's got to juggle right now.
Let me say one last thing about an independent candidate. We are headed for such a tight election. I think David will agree with me that if there is what we will call a decent independent candidate, one who can get 2% in a certain set of states, then still, most likely speaking, President Obama is going to win re-election. The question for President Obama is not can he hold on to moderates. It goes to your point. Can he get establishments, independents? And the best way for him to do that is to try to win back the Clinton Democrats in the Midwest who've sort of soured on him and are having buyer's remorse. If he can do that, then he can shut the Republican out of the White House.
I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the influence of social media. Barack Obama used it very well in 2008. Obviously, it's much more sophisticated now, 4 years down the road. But what role is it going to play, and what candidate right now of the GOP contenders is best equipped to combine the best of social media with what we know about traditional voter outreach?
Well, right now,
I think the answer to that is it's got to be Ron Paul. I mean, but that's within the Republican primary. I mean, the notion, I was listening to a talk radio here in Colorado, and somebody was saying, how is Mitt Romney going to use social media and appeal to young people? I mean, Mitt Romney, social media, and young people are like three terms that I can't even imagine going together. They just don't really fit together. So I think it's a big quandary if the Republicans' nominee is Mitt Romney. But again, I think it speaks to the larger issue here. Because I don't think President Obama is going to have nearly that kind or that sort of tone of support that he had in the 2008 election. We may end up seeing an election where we have one of the lowest turnouts of any presidential election that people can remember, because you may end up having a Democratic president running for re-election who has a much more demoralized base, and a Republican nominee who the base of the Republican Party don't see as a true conservative.
Well, to your point, though, real quick about social media and the Republican candidates, remember, we are in a super PAC era, and for a lot of viewers, that means that there's third-party groups that are out there pushing the message of those candidates. And right now, I'm not sure that Mitt Romney needs the type of social media, let's say he wins the nomination, he needs the type of social media presence that Barack Obama had in 2008. That was very cutting edge, because right now we have a lot more players in there. And within the Republican primary, it's very hard for a lot of them to take on social media and sort of put the time and effort into it, because right now every single Republican primary, every single debate is front and center in the mainstream media so much that everybody knows about it, at least in those nominating contests and in those battleground states. So there's almost no impetus at this point for them to do it. And back to your point about Ron Paul, Ron Paul's doing a great job, but let's look at Rick Santorum right now in Iowa. He basically tied for the lead by spending 73 cents on each vote he wound up getting. He got 30,000 votes in the caucus. And what that means is, to a lot of folks, retail politics meant more, at least as these nominating contests go on. When we start talking about the 8 battleground states and the inability to be able to go door to door in each of them, then I think social media will play a much bigger role.
David Sirota, I want to address you first with this next question. I want to talk about negative campaign ads. Newsweek says you are well schooled in Washington warfare, and you may be the best to answer these questions. You know, Americans say they don't want negative campaigns. They want to hear about content. They want to hear about real issues. But then we see in Iowa that Americans are responding to negative campaigns. What do we have to look forward here to for the next 9 months in terms of 10 months in terms of campaign ads?
Well, look, I'm a data person too, and so you look at data and you ask people, do you like negative campaigning? They say no. You ask people, are you a liberal? Are you conservative? Are you a moderate? Most people want to look at themselves and say they're a moderate. You don't really get at what people actually believe when you ask questions that way. Do people say they like negative campaigning? Of course they say they don't like it. Do people respond to negative campaigning? Absolutely. It's been shown over and over and over again. And I think that's what we're going to see for the next many months, both in the Republican Party, with the candidates there going up against each other, and then coming out of the primary and into the general election. And I think you're going to see the same thing from President Obama, whoever the nominee is.
Well, to David's point with respect to negative ads, I think we're going to ratchet it up in the Republican primary going forward. And I think that Mitt Romney is going to wind up being the recipient of more of those negative ads. But I do think in the general election, whoever the Republican nominee is, we are headed towards one of the nastiest, most negative elections probably in the history of politics, given the impact that social media and the web plays in campaigning today.
Michelle Diggles, we've got about 30 seconds left. We'll give you the last word.
Well, I think, the key for 2012 is that independents are going to be the deciders. They're rented and not owned. They think there's a pox on both houses, both Democrats and Republicans. And we'll see where they end up breaking, because whichever candidate courts them is going to win in November.
All right. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And that is going to do it from our team here in Washington, D.C. for now. But we do want to hear from you. We'd like you to tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Just send your emails directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.